My name is Rosa, and I'm 35 years old. For 12 years, I was married to Marcus, the man I thought was my soulmate. As I stood in front of the mirror that evening, adjusting the red Versace dress I'd bought specifically for his promotion dinner, I had no idea my entire world was about to shatter. Marcus had been acting strange all week, but I brushed it off as pre-promotion nerves. I didn't know that tucked inside his suit pocket was an envelope that would change everything. Before I continue with what happened that night, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this. Now let me tell you about the most humiliating yet ultimately liberating night of my life. I met Marcus during our second year at Columbia Law School. We were both ambitious, both driven, both convinced we would conquer the world together. I was 23, fresh from graduating summa cum laude from Georgetown, and Marcus was 25, having worked 2 years at a tech startup before pursuing his MBA. We sat next to each other in corporate finance, and when he asked to borrow my notes after missing a class, I felt that immediate spark. Our courtship was intense and passionate. Marcus would show up at my apartment at 2 in the morning with Chinese takeout when he knew I was studying for the bar exam. I would proofread his business proposals using my legal expertise to strengthen his arguments. We were a team, or so I believed. When Marcus proposed on graduation day right there in front of Low Library with our families watching, I said yes without hesitation. The early years of our marriage coincided with Marcus launching TechVision, his software company focused on AI-driven analytics. I had just received an offer from Winston & Straus, one of New York's most prestigious law firms, with a starting salary of $220,000. The position was everything I had worked for, but Marcus sat me down one evening and laid out his vision. He needed someone he could trust to help build the company. Someone who understood contracts, negotiations, intellectual property law. Someone who believed in him completely. The way he looked at me, the passion in his voice when he described what we could build together, it was intoxicating. I turned down Winston & Straus the next day. My grandmother had left me an inheritance of $200,000 when she passed during my final year of law school. She had worked her entire life as a seamstress, saving every penny, wanting her granddaughters to have opportunities she never had. I invested every cent into TechVision. Marcus promised me we were building our future together. For 3 years, I worked 18-hour days without taking a salary. I wrote contracts, negotiated with suppliers, sweet-talked potential clients, and refined pitch decks until they were perfect. When Marcus would come home defeated after a failed investor meeting, I was the one who helped him see what went wrong and how to fix it. I was the one who introduced him to Robert Thompson, my father's college roommate, who ran a venture capital firm. That introduction changed everything. Thompson saw potential in TechVision and invested $2 million in our Series A round. Marcus was ecstatic, lifting me up and spinning me around in our tiny apartment kitchen. We celebrated with champagne that cost $15, dreaming about the future we were creating. As TechVision grew from a 2-person operation in our garage to a company with 30, then 50, then eventually 150 employees, my role became less defined, but no less critical. Officially, I was nothing. Marcus had convinced me that having his spouse on the payroll would look unprofessional to investors. Unofficially, I was everything. I managed relationships with key clients, smoothed over conflicts between department heads, and served as Marcus's sounding board for every major decision. The subject of children came up repeatedly over the years. I wanted to start a family, to have something beyond the company that was ours. Marcus always had a reason to wait. First, it was until after the Series B funding. Then it was until we reached profitability. Then it was until he made senior management. When I suffered my first miscarriage at 31, Marcus held me while I sobbed, but I heard him on the phone the next day telling his business partner that maybe it was for the best that we needed to focus on the IPO. The second miscarriage came a year later. This time, Marcus barely paused his work schedule. He sent flowers to the hospital with a card signed by his assistant. The third miscarriage, just 6 months ago, happened while Marcus was at a conference in San Francisco. He didn't come home early. By then, I had learned to grieve alone. Looking back, I can see the signs were there. The late nights became later. The weekend work trips became more frequent. The way he would guard his phone suddenly needing a passcode when he had never had one before. The new cologne, the gym membership he actually used, the subtle comments about my appearance. I had gained 15 pounds over the years, stress weight from managing his life while neglecting my own. 6 months ago, Brittany joined TechVision as Marcus's executive assistant. 24 years old, fresh from Stanford, with legs that seemed to go on forever, and blonde hair that caught the light like spun gold. Marcus mentioned her constantly. Brittany had such innovative ideas. Brittany understood the tech industry in a way most people didn't. Brittany was going places. I met Brittany at the company 4th of July barbecue. She wore a white sundress that left little to the imagination and spent the entire afternoon at Marcus's side laughing at his jokes with a tinkling sound that made my skin crawl. When I introduced myself as Marcus's wife, she looked me up and down with barely concealed surprise, as if she couldn't understand how someone like Marcus had ended up with someone like me. The preparation for Marcus's promotion dinner began 2 weeks before the actual event. After 5 years as Chief Technology Officer, he was being elevated to Chief Executive Officer. The board of directors had finally recognized what I had always known, that Marcus had the vision to lead the company into its next phase of growth. I threw myself into planning the perfect celebration. I booked the Grand Marquis, the Michelin-starred restaurant, where we had celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary. I carefully curated the guest list of 50 people, including key investors, board members, important clients, and selected senior staff. I worked with the restaurant's event coordinator to design a menu that accommodated every dietary restriction and preference. I even hired a photographer to capture the moment of Marcus's triumph. The week before the dinner, Marcus's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would leave for work before I woke up and return after I had gone to bed. When we did cross paths, he avoided eye contact and answered my questions in monosyllables. I found him on our balcony at 3 a.m, speaking in hushed tones on his phone. When I asked who he was talking to, he claimed it was the Tokyo office, but TechVision didn't have a Tokyo office. The morning of the promotion dinner, I went to the salon for a full treatment. Hair, nails, makeup, the works. I wanted to look perfect standing beside Marcus as he accepted his new role. The hairdresser commented on how excited I must be, and I smiled and agreed, pushing down the unease that had been growing in my stomach for days. That red Versace dress had cost $3,000. When I had shown it to Marcus the week before, he had frowned and asked if it was really necessary to spend so much on something I would wear once. The woman I had been a year ago would have returned it, but something made me keep it. Maybe some part of me knew I needed armor for what was coming. As I arrived at the Grand Marquis that evening, the early December air was crisp and biting. I had come separately from Marcus, who said he needed to prepare some remarks with Brittany. The restaurant glowed with warm light, and through the windows I could see the private dining room we had reserved already filling with guests. I spent the first hour of the reception in full hostess mode, greeting each arrival personally, ensuring everyone had drinks, making introductions between people who should know each other. Several people complimented my dress, and Robert Thompson pulled me aside to tell me how proud he was of what Marcus and I had built together. I smiled and thanked him, not correcting his assumption that I was officially part of TechVision's success story. The Grand Marquis exceeded every expectation that night. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the burgundy walls, while white orchid centerpieces adorned each table. The private dining room overlooked Central Park, its winter landscape twinkling with holiday lights. 50 of New York's tech elite mingled with champagne flutes, their conversations a symphony of success and ambition. I watched Marcus work the room with the confidence of a man who knew he had arrived. His charcoal Tom Ford suit fit him perfectly, the same suit I had helped him select for this exact occasion. He moved from group to group, shaking hands, sharing laughs, completely in his element. Not once did he look for me. Not once did he reach for my hand or include me in his conversations. Brittany arrived 45 minutes late, making an entrance that turned every head in the room. Her white bandage dress hugged every curve, and her hair fell in perfect waves past her shoulders. She walked straight to Marcus, placing her hand on his arm with a familiarity that made my chest tighten. When she whispered something in his ear, he threw his head back and laughed, a genuine laugh I hadn't heard directed at me in months. I busied myself with managing the evening's timeline. Cocktail hour was ending, and we needed to move to the seated dinner portion. I coordinated with the restaurant staff, ensuring the champagne for the toast was properly chilled and the special dietary meals were correctly assigned. Margaret Chen, one of the board members, complimented my organizational skills, saying Marcus was lucky to have such a capable wife. I thanked her, wondering if capable was all I had become. As guests took their seats, I noticed the place cards had been rearranged. My seat, originally next to Marcus at the head table, had been moved 3 places down. Brittany now sat at his right hand. When I quietly asked the server about the change, he said Mr. Davidson had requested it 20 minutes ago. I swallowed my humiliation and took my new seat, maintaining my smile as if this was exactly what I had planned. The 5-course meal was exquisite. Oysters, Rockefeller lobster bisque, Wagyu beef with truffle reduction, but every bite tasted like sawdust in my mouth. I made polite conversation with the venture capitalist to my left and the software engineer to my right, all while watching Marcus and Brittany from the corner of my eye. Their heads bent together, her hand occasionally touching his shoulder, his eyes never leaving her face. Between the 3rd and 4th courses, Marcus stood to give his first speech. He thanked the board for their faith in him, outlined his vision for TechVision's future, and recognized several key employees who had contributed to the company's success. Not once did he mention my name. Not once did he acknowledge the woman who had given up her career, invested her inheritance, and spent 12 years building his dream alongside him. Robert Thompson, seated across from me, caught my eye with a look of confusion. He knew the truth. He had been there from the beginning, had seen me in those early meetings, had watched me negotiate contracts that saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. His expression asked the question I couldn't answer. Why was Marcus pretending I didn't exist? As dessert arrived, individual dark chocolate soufflés with Grand Marnier cream, Marcus stood again. The room fell silent, anticipating another toast to celebrate his promotion. Instead, he cleared his throat and said he had an important announcement that couldn't wait any longer. My heart began racing, though I couldn't explain why. Marcus called me to stand beside him. For a moment, wild hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe he was finally going to acknowledge everything I had done. Maybe he was going to announce that I would be taking an official role in the company. I rose from my seat, smoothing my red dress, and walked to his side with as much grace as I could muster. The room watched expectantly as Marcus reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a thick envelope, and that's when I saw the law firm's logo in the corner. Brennan Hoffman and Associates, divorce attorneys. My legs nearly gave out, but I forced myself to remain standing to keep that smile frozen on my face, even as my world tilted off its axis. Marcus held the envelope out to me with steady hands. His voice carried clearly through the room as he said these words that are burned into my memory forever. You should read this now, Rosa. I think it's time everyone here knows that we're moving in different directions. My success requires a partner who can match my ambition, not hold me back with outdated expectations. The silence that followed was deafening. 50 successful, confident people suddenly didn't know where to look. I took the envelope with trembling fingers and opened it right there, because what else could I do? The words "petition for dissolution of marriage" swam before my eyes. The grounds cited were irreconcilable differences, and Marcus had already signed his name with the same flourish he used on billion-dollar contracts. I looked up from the papers to find everyone staring at me. Some with pity, others with shock, a few with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for car accidents. Brittany stood slightly behind Marcus, not even trying to hide her satisfied smirk. Her hand rested possessively on his shoulder, her diamond bracelet catching the light. The urge to scream, to throw wine in his face, to tear the papers into confetti was overwhelming. Instead, I did something that I think surprised everyone, including myself. I laughed. Not a hysterical laugh, but a quiet chuckle that seemed to echo in the silence. Then I spoke, my voice carrying the kind of calm that comes when you've moved past emotion into pure clarity. Thank you, Marcus, for having the courage to do this in front of everyone. It saves me from having to explain why I'm no longer part of your life. Though I do find it interesting that you chose to humiliate me at the very celebration I planned with the guests I invited in the restaurant I booked. It shows a level of cruelty I didn't know you possessed, which I suppose makes this easier. I set the papers on the table next to his untouched souffle. Then I looked directly at Brittany and said something that made her smirk falter. I hope you're prepared for what you're getting. When a man is willing to destroy someone who gave him everything, imagine what he'll do to someone who can only give him some things. The walk from that table to the door felt like miles. My heels clicked against the marble floor, each step echoing in the continued silence. As I reached for the door handle, I heard Robert Thompson's voice cut through the room. Rosa, wait. But I didn't wait. I couldn't. I pushed through the door and out into the December night where the cold air hit my face like a wake-up call. Behind me, I heard the explosion of voices as the room erupted in chaos. Through the window, I saw Thompson standing nose to nose with Marcus, his face red with anger. Several guests were already putting on their coats, clearly wanting to escape the discomfort. Marcus stood in the center of it all, his jaw set in defiance, while Brittany clung to his arm like she was afraid he might float away. The valet brought my car, a 10-year-old Honda that Marcus always said embarrassed him. I gave the young man a $50 tip, the last big tip I would give for a while, and drove away from the Grand Marquis, from my marriage, from the life I had built around someone else's dreams. I drove without destination or purpose, my hands gripping the steering wheel while my mind tried to process what had just happened. The Hudson River appeared on my right, its dark waters reflecting the city lights like broken glass. I pulled into a scenic overlook and sat there for 3 hours watching the water and replaying every moment of the last 12 years. The tears didn't come. Perhaps I was in shock, or perhaps some part of me had been preparing for this moment without realizing it. Instead, I felt a strange hollowness, as if someone had scooped out my insides and left only the shell. My phone buzzed incessantly with calls and texts, but I turned it off without looking at any of them. By the time I returned to our brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, it was past 3 in the morning. The house was dark, and Marcus's Tesla wasn't in the driveway. Inside, everything looked exactly as I had left it that afternoon, except for a single sheet of paper on the kitchen counter. A note from Marcus's lawyer stating I had 30 days to vacate the premises, as the house was solely in Marcus's name. I poured myself a glass of the Macallan 18-year. We had been saving for a special occasion, and laughed bitterly at the irony. Then I walked through each room of the house I had decorated, remembering the moments we had shared there. The kitchen where we had danced to jazz while cooking Sunday dinners. The living room where we had celebrated TechVision's first million in revenue. The bedroom where we had tried so desperately to create the children we would never have. The next morning arrived with brutal clarity. I woke up on the couch, still in my $3,000 dress, my carefully styled hair, now a tangled mess. The doorbell rang insistently until I dragged myself to answer it. Laura stood on my doorstep with coffee and bagels, her expression a mixture of rage and sympathy. Laura Winters had been my best friend since Columbia. She was now a senior partner at a boutique divorce firm, which felt like the universe's twisted sense of humor. She had never liked Marcus calling him a narcissist wrapped in entrepreneur's clothing. As she surveyed my disheveled state, her jaw clenched with barely controlled anger. She had already heard about last night. Apparently, videos of my humiliation were circulating in New York's tech and legal circles. Someone had filmed my exit and Marcus's cold expression as I left. Laura had brought her laptop and showed me the emails from reporters wanting statements, the LinkedIn posts from attendees expressing shock, and the Twitter threads dissecting what they called the most brutal public divorce announcement in recent memory. We spent the morning reviewing the divorce papers. Marcus had been planning this for months. Assets had been quietly moved, accounts restructured, and documentation prepared that painted me as nothing more than a housewife who had contributed nothing to TechVision's success. There was no mention of my investment, my unpaid labor, or my strategic contributions. According to the papers, I was entitled to basic spousal support for 1 year and nothing else. Laura wanted to fight. She pulled up case law about marital assets, talked about deposing witnesses who knew about my contributions, and strategized about getting a forensic accountant to trace my grandmother's investment. She was confident we could get at least 50% of everything, including TechVision stock, that was now worth millions. But as she talked, outlining a battle that would take years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, I realized something. I didn't want to fight for scraps of a life that was never really mine. I didn't want to spend the next 3 years in courtrooms, reliving every moment of my marriage trying to prove my worth to judges and lawyers. I wanted to be free. The next few days passed in a blur of logistics. I went to the house while Marcus was at work, accompanied by Laura and 2 moving trucks. I took only what was undeniably mine: my clothes, my grandmother's jewelry, my books, the art I had purchased before our marriage. I left everything else, including the wedding china we had received from his parents and the furniture we had selected together. In the master bedroom, I found evidence of Brittany's presence. A lace thong that wasn't mine tucked behind the dresser, long blonde hairs on what had been my pillow, the smell of her perfume something young and floral that made me nauseous. In Marcus's home office, I saw architectural plans for renovations dated 3 months ago, turning my craft room into a nursery. That's when Marcus and Brittany arrived, clearly tipped off by the security system that I was in the house. Brittany wore one of my robes, the silk one Marcus had given me for our 10th anniversary. Her hand rested on her still flat stomach in a gesture that told me everything I needed to know. Marcus stood behind her, protective and defiant. The conversation that followed was brief and brutal. Marcus informed me that Brittany was 11 weeks pregnant. They had been together for 6 months. He had never loved me the way he loved her. I had been useful once, but that time had passed. TechVision needed a CEO with a partner who understood the modern tech world, not someone stuck in the past. Brittany couldn't resist adding her own commentary. She told me how Marcus had confided in her about feeling trapped in our marriage, how he had felt obligated to stay because of my miscarriages, how relieved he was to finally be with someone who shared his vision for the future. Each word was carefully chosen to wound, and she delivered them with the practiced cruelty of someone who had rehearsed this moment. I could have told her the truth, that Marcus would one day look at her the way he was looking at me now, with cold calculation, that her youth and beauty would fade, and he would find another executive assistant with longer legs and bigger dreams, that the baby she carried would become just another obligation he would resent. But I didn't. She would learn these lessons herself in time. Instead, I signed the divorce papers right there on his desk, using the same Mont Blanc pen he had given me for our first anniversary. I declined spousal support, wanting nothing that would keep me connected to him. Laura protested, but I silenced her with a look. I wanted a clean break, complete separation, total freedom from Marcus Davidson and everything he represented. As I walked out of that house for the last time, carrying only a box of personal items, Marcus called after me. "You'll regret this, Rosa. You'll never have what we built here. You'll end up exactly where you started, nowhere." I stopped at the threshold and turned back one final time. "You're right, Marcus. I'll end up where I started, with dignity, integrity, and the knowledge that everything I achieve will be mine alone." The studio apartment in Venice Beach was 600 square feet of potential. At $1,200 a month, it was what I could afford with the $5,000 I had managed to save in my personal account over the years. The walls needed painting, the kitchen consisted of a hot plate and mini fridge, and the bathroom required strategic positioning to close the door while inside. But it was mine. The first week after leaving Marcus was the hardest. Not because I missed him, but because I had to confront how completely I had disappeared into his life. My resume had a 12-year gap. My professional network consisted of Marcus's contacts. My daily routine had revolved entirely around supporting his needs. At 35, I was starting over with less than I'd had at 23. I applied for jobs at law firms, but 12 years out of practice made me unhireable at my previous level. The positions available to me were paralegal roles, paying a quarter of what I had turned down at Winston and Straus. One interviewer, a partner who looked younger than me, actually asked if I was sure I wanted to return to work after being a housewife for so long. Necessity bred creativity. I started taking freelance legal consulting work, helping small businesses with contracts and compliance issues. The pay was modest, but it was mine. I worked from coffee shops with free Wi-Fi stretching a $3 coffee across 8 hours. At night, I taught myself new skills through online courses, updating my knowledge of corporate law and learning about tech startups from the legal side. 3 weeks into my new life, Robert Thompson called. He apologized for not reaching out sooner, said he had been trying to figure out the right way to approach me. Then he made an offer that surprised me. His venture capital firm, Thompson Holdings, needed a legal consultant to evaluate potential investments. The salary was modest, $60,000 to start, but there would be equity participation in successful deals. I met Thompson at a small cafe in Santa Monica. Over green tea and avocado toast that I couldn't really afford, he told me the truth about that night at the Grand Marquis. He had been planning to pull Thompson Holdings' investment from Tech Vision. Marcus's behavior had shown a level of poor judgment that made him a liability. The board was already discussing his replacement, though Marcus didn't know it yet. Thompson also revealed something that made my hands shake. He had always assumed I was a silent partner in Tech Vision. My strategic insights during those early meetings, my ability to identify potential problems in contracts, my skill at managing difficult personalities, these were the reasons he had invested. He had thought Marcus was smart for keeping me behind the scenes. He had no idea I had never been compensated or credited. The work at Thompson Holdings started immediately. I reviewed pitch decks, analyzed business models, and identified legal red flags in potential investments. Thompson gave me increasingly complex projects testing my abilities. When I successfully negotiated a deal that saved the firm $2 million in potential liability, he increased my equity percentage and gave me my own office. During lunch breaks, I worked on something personal. 3 years ago, I had proposed an idea to Marcus for a legal tech platform that would provide affordable legal services to women going through divorce. He had dismissed it as too niche, not scalable enough. Now, with my hard-earned understanding of both law and tech, I began building it myself. I taught myself basic coding through YouTube tutorials and Stack Overflow forums. Every evening from 8 until midnight, I wrote code-designed user interfaces and built databases. My fingers cramped, my eyes burned, and more than once I cried from frustration when bugs destroyed hours of work. But slowly, painfully, beautifully, the platform began to take shape. Jennifer Park found me through a Women in Tech meetup I attended for the free pizza. She was a full-stack developer who had just left Google disillusioned with corporate culture. When I showed her my amateur code, she didn't laugh. Instead, she saw the potential and offered to help refactor it properly. Within 2 weeks, she had transformed my clumsy prototype into something professional. Amy Rodriguez came next, a UX designer who had gone through her own brutal divorce and immediately understood the platform's value. She redesigned every screen with the empathy and clarity that only comes from lived experience. She worked for equity, only believing in what we were building more than immediate payment. We called it EmpowerHer Legal. Not the most creative name, but it said exactly what we were. The platform connected women with affordable lawyers, provided document templates, offered support groups, and created a safe space for sharing resources and experiences. Every feature addressed a pain point I had experienced or witnessed during my own divorce. We launched the beta version 2 months after I left Marcus. No marketing budget, just posts in Facebook groups and divorce support forums. Within 3 days, we had 100 users. Within a week, 500. Women shared their stories, lawyers volunteered their time for reduced rates, and slowly, organically, a community formed around shared experience and mutual support. The first media coverage came from a tech blogger who had gone through her own divorce. She wrote about finding EmpowerHer Legal at 2 a.m, crying over legal documents she couldn't afford to have professionally reviewed. Our platform had connected her with a lawyer who worked out a payment plan and a support group of women who had walked the same path. Her article went viral in certain circles. Then came the moment that changed everything. Sharon Williams, a partner at Sisterhood Ventures, a fund that invested exclusively in women-led startups, reached out. She had been watching our growth, had created a fake account to experience the platform herself, and wanted to meet. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon in their downtown Los Angeles office. I wore my only remaining designer outfit, a navy blazer and skirt that had survived the divorce purge. Jennifer and Amy flanked me as we pitched our vision. We showed our user growth, our retention rates, our pathway to profitability. But more than numbers, we shared stories. Real women whose lives had been changed by having access to affordable legal help and emotional support during the worst times of their lives. Sharon listened, asked pointed questions, and challenged our assumptions. Then she made an offer. $100,000 in seed funding with a clear path to Series A if we hit certain metrics. But more valuable than the money was the mentorship, the connections, and the validation that what we were building mattered. The same week the funding came through. Sarah Mitchell called. Sarah had been CFO at TechVision until 6 months ago, when Marcus had pushed her out to make room for one of his buddies. She had insider information she thought I should know. Over wine at her apartment, she laid out the truth about what was happening at the company I had helped build. The unraveling of TechVision began with small fractures that quickly became gaping wounds. Sarah showed me internal emails and Slack messages from former colleagues still at the company. The picture they painted was one of chaos masquerading as transformation. Marcus had promoted Brittany to Chief Financial Officer, despite her having no financial experience beyond a bachelor's degree in communications. The first major crack appeared in the third quarter financial report. Brittany had miscategorized nearly $3 million in expenses, making it appear that TechVision was more profitable than reality. When the auditors caught the error, she claimed it was an innocent mistake, but the board began asking questions. Marcus defended her publicly while privately scrambling to fix the mess. 3 senior engineers resigned in a single week. These were the people who had built TechVision's core technology, who understood the intricate code that powered everything. They cited cultural differences and lack of technical leadership. The truth, according to Sarah's sources, was that they couldn't stand watching Brittany make technical decisions she didn't understand while Marcus backed her blindly. The Google contract, worth $8 million annually, was TechVision's flagship client relationship. I had nurtured that relationship for 5 years, knew every stakeholder personally, and understood their needs intimately. Without me there to maintain those connections, communication broke down. When Google requested modifications to their service agreement, Brittany handled the negotiation personally. She managed to insult their senior vice president and propose terms that were borderline illegal. Google didn't just decline to renew. They sent a formal complaint to TechVision's board about unprofessional conduct and threatened legal action if certain proprietary data wasn't returned immediately. The story leaked to TechCrunch, and suddenly TechVision's reputation in Silicon Valley was toxic. Other clients began reconsidering their contracts. Meanwhile, Brittany was living like she had already made it to the Forbes list. Sarah had documentation of company credit card charges that would make your head spin. $20,000 at Barney's in a single afternoon. First-class flights to Miami for weekend getaways. A $40,000 birthday party charged as a client entertainment expense, except no clients attended. The investigation into these expenses revealed something worse. Brittany had been sharing proprietary TechVision information with competitors. Screenshots surfaced of her at dinner with the CEO of TechVision's biggest rival, documents visible on the table between them. When confronted, she claimed she was exploring partnership opportunities, but the damage was done. The board called an emergency meeting. 5 members flew in from various locations, and the discussion lasted 8 hours. Sarah's contact in the room said Marcus spent the entire time defending Brittany, claiming the board was overreacting, that this was just the growing pains of transformation. When they voted to launch a formal investigation, Marcus threatened to resign. They called his bluff. The board unanimously accepted his resignation, effective immediately. Marcus was escorted from the building by security, his company laptop and phone confiscated on the spot. The man who had spent 12 years building Tech Vision was banned from the premises he had once ruled. The pregnancy that Brittany had used as her trump card turned out to be another manipulation. When the stress of the investigation hit, she miscarried, or claimed to. Sarah had heard from a nurse friend at Cedars-Sinai that Brittany had never been pregnant at all. The medical records she had shown Marcus were forgeries, part of an elaborate scheme to secure her position. Within days of Marcus's termination, Brittany filed a lawsuit. She claimed sexual harassment, hostile work environment, and wrongful termination. Her lawyer, someone known for taking cases that generated media attention regardless of merit, held a press conference on the steps of the courthouse. Brittany cried on camera, claiming Marcus had forced her into a relationship and then discarded her when she became inconvenient. Marcus's assets were frozen pending investigation. The brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, the Tesla, the investment accounts, everything was locked down. The man who had humiliated me for not matching his ambition was now sleeping on his brother's couch in New Jersey, wearing the same 3 suits on rotation, because he couldn't access his wardrobe. During all of this, EmpowerHer Legal was thriving. We had expanded to 10,000 users across 3 states. The Series A funding Sharon had mentioned came through at $5 million. We hired our first employees, moved into a real office in Marina del Rey, and launched features that made legal help accessible to women who had never thought they could afford it. I was in the middle of a team meeting when reception called to say someone was insisting on seeing me. No appointment wouldn't give a name, but said it was urgent. I almost refused, but something made me curious. When I walked into the lobby, Marcus stood there in a wrinkled suit, his face gaunt, his usual confidence completely shattered. Security stood ready to escort him out, but I waved them off. I led him to a small conference room, more out of curiosity than compassion. The man sitting across from me looked nothing like the Marcus who had stood in the Grand Marquis 4 months ago, publicly destroying our marriage for sport. His hands shook as he talked. TechVision's new CEO was suing him personally for fraud. Brittany's lawsuit was gaining traction. His lawyer had dropped him when the retainer ran out. His brother was kicking him out at the end of the week. He had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, nothing left of the empire he had built on other people's backs. Then came the part I had been expecting. Marcus wanted my help. Not money, he was quick to clarify, though the pause after suggested he wouldn't refuse it. He needed legal advice connections, someone who understood TechVision's history to help him fight the allegations. He actually said with no apparent irony that I was the only person who really knew the company who could testify to his character. The conference room fell silent as I processed the absolute audacity of his request. This man had stood in front of 50 people and announced that I had contributed nothing to his success. He had kicked me out of my home with 30 days' notice. He had erased 12 years of my life with a few signatures. Now he sat here asking me to save him. I could have laughed. I could have raged. I could have listed every sacrifice, every contribution, every moment he had taken credit for my work. Instead, I pulled out my phone and found the contact information for a competent defense attorney who specialized in corporate fraud. Not the best, not the worst, but someone who would give him adequate representation. Then I looked at the man I had once loved enough to give up everything. His hair was thinning faster, stress accelerating what genetics had started. His skin had a gray pallor that spoke of sleepless nights and too much alcohol. His hands, which had once signed deals with confidence, now trembled with the weight of consequences. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice neutral and professional, "I'm going to give you something you never gave me: dignity in defeat. Here's the name of a lawyer who will take your case. He's fair and thorough. I'm also going to give you the number for a therapist who specializes in narcissistic collapse. You need help, not just legal, but psychological." He started to speak, probably to manipulate or bargain or plead, but I held up my hand. "Our business is concluded. I built my life around you once and it nearly destroyed me. But that destruction led to my reconstruction. I found out who I am without you, and it turns out I'm exactly who I was meant to be. Someone who builds rather than tears down. Someone who lifts others rather than climbs on their backs." I stood to leave, then paused at the door. One last thing. That investment from my grandmother, the one you conveniently forgot existed. My lawyer found the paper trail. The statute of limitations hasn't expired. I could sue you and probably win, but I won't. Consider it my final gift to you, the knowledge that you owe your entire start to someone you threw away like garbage, and they still showed you more mercy than you ever showed them. Walking out of that conference room, leaving Marcus to his shattered life, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete absolute freedom. Not just from him, but from anger, from resentment, from the need for revenge. The best revenge, I realized, was not needing revenge at all. 3 weeks later, the news broke that Marcus had been charged with fraud and embezzlement. The investigation revealed he had been siphoning money from TechVision for years, hiding it in offshore accounts. Brittany's lawsuit was thrown out when her forged medical records were discovered, and she was charged with extortion. The two of them made headlines for all the wrong reasons. Meanwhile, my face was on the cover of Entrepreneur magazine. The headline read, "From Divorce Papers to CEO, How Rosa Martinez Built a Legal Tech Empire from Heartbreak." The article talked about Empower, her legal's rapid growth, our innovative approach to making legal services accessible, and our recent expansion into 10 new states. The journey from that devastating night at the Grand Marquis to where I stand today wasn't linear. There were nights I cried myself to sleep in that tiny studio apartment, mornings I couldn't get out of bed, and moments I wondered if Marcus had been right about my worth. But each small victory built upon the last, creating momentum that eventually became unstoppable. The therapy started 3 weeks after I signed the divorce papers. Dr. Patricia Chen specialized in trauma from narcissistic abuse, and she helped me understand that what happened wasn't my fault. Marcus hadn't changed. He had simply revealed who he always was. The signs had been there from the beginning, but love and hope had made me blind to them. I learned about something called coercive control, how abusers systematically strip away their victims' independence until they can't imagine life any other way. Marcus had convinced me that my value lay only in supporting him, that my dreams were less important than his, that my sacrifices were investments in our future, when really they were just feeding his ego. The healing wasn't just psychological, but physical too. I started running along Venice Beach at sunrise, something I hadn't done since law school. Those early morning runs became my meditation, my time to process everything that had happened and plan what came next. I lost the stress weight that had accumulated over years of neglecting myself, but more importantly, I found strength I didn't know existed. Building genuine friendships became a priority. Jennifer and Amy weren't just business partners. They became the sisters I never had. We shared dinners in each other's apartments, celebrated small victories with champagne we could barely afford, and held each other through the setbacks that threatened to derail us. They taught me that real partners lift each other up rather than standing on each other's shoulders. 6 months after launching EmpowerHer Legal, we hit a milestone that seemed impossible when we started. 50,000 active users across 15 states. Our platform had facilitated over $10 million in reduced-cost legal services. We had connected 3,000 women with pro bono attorneys. The support groups we hosted had become lifelines for women navigating the worst periods of their lives. The recognition came in waves, first local news coverage, then national media attention. When we won TechCrunch's Startup of the Year award, I stood on the same stage where Marcus had once pitched TechVision. The difference was that this time the success was genuinely mine. Every line of code, every strategic decision, every sacrifice had been my choice. The invitation to speak at Harvard Business School came as a shock. They wanted me to talk about pivoting after failure, about finding opportunity in destruction. Standing in front of 200 MBA students, I told them the truth. That sometimes the biggest failure is staying in a situation that diminishes you. That success means nothing if you achieve it by stepping on others. That true leadership comes from lifting others as you climb. One student asked how I forgave Marcus for what he did. The answer came easily. Forgiveness wasn't for him. It was for me. Holding on to anger would have been like drinking poison and expecting him to suffer. I forgave him not because he deserved it, but because I deserved peace. That didn't mean forgetting or excusing his behavior. It meant releasing its hold on my future. A year after that horrible night, I received an unexpected message through LinkedIn. Robert Thompson wanted to meet, and this time it wasn't about business. Over dinner at a quiet restaurant in Malibu, he made a confession. He had been investigating what really happened with TechVision's founding, and he had discovered the truth about my grandmother's investment, about my unpaid work, about everything I had contributed. Thompson had a proposal. He wanted to create a fund specifically for women who had been pushed out of companies they helped build. He wanted me to run it to use my experience to identify and support women whose contributions had been erased. The fund would be $50 million to start with potential for expansion. We would right the wrongs that happened too often in Silicon Valley. The Thompson-Martinez Fund launched 3 months later. Our first investment went to a woman whose ex-business partner had stolen her algorithm and built a company worth millions while she struggled to pay rent. Our second went to a wife who had supported her husband through medical school and residency, only to be divorced the day he made partner. Each investment was more than money. It was validation that their contributions mattered. Today, EmpowerHer Legal operates in all 50 states, with over 200,000 active users. We've raised $30 million in funding and are valued at $200 million. More importantly, we've helped 50,000 women navigate divorce with dignity and support. The platform that Marcus dismissed as not scalable enough has become the largest legal tech company focused on women's services. I moved out of that studio apartment into a house in Manhattan Beach. Not a mansion, but a comfortable home with an ocean view and a garden where I grow tomatoes and basil. I wake up each morning with purpose, knowing that my work makes a real difference in real people's lives. The Forbes 30 Under 40 recognition sits on my bookshelf next to a photo of my grandmother, the woman whose sacrifice made everything possible. Dating hasn't been a priority, but recently I met David at a charity event for women entrepreneurs. He runs a nonprofit that teaches coding to underserved communities. He's kind, intelligent, and most importantly, secure enough in himself to celebrate my success rather than compete with it. We take things slow, both of us carrying scars from past relationships, but willing to explore what something healthy might look like. Marcus's story ended differently. After serving 6 months in minimum security prison for fraud, he emerged to find himself unemployable in tech. The last I heard, he was working as a consultant for a small firm in Ohio, making less than what I pay our junior developers. His social media, once full of motivational quotes about grinding and hustling, has gone silent. Brittany disappeared from public view after her extortion charges were dropped in exchange for testifying against Marcus. Someone told me she moved back to her hometown in Arizona, working at her father's real estate agency. The woman who thought she had won by stealing my husband learned that you can't build happiness on someone else's misery. The dress I wore that night, that $3,000 red Versace, hangs in my closet still. Not as a reminder of humiliation, but as armor that protected me during the moment my real life began. Sometimes I run my fingers across the fabric and thank that woman who stood in the Grand Marquis, thinking her world was ending, not knowing it was actually beginning. The lessons from this journey are carved into my bones now. Never lose yourself in someone else's dream. Your worth isn't determined by who stands beside you, but by who you are when you stand alone. The greatest revenge against those who try to diminish you is to become everything they said you couldn't be. And sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that could have happened for you. That divorce paper Marcus handed me in front of 50 witnesses wasn't an ending. It was an invitation to finally fully authentically become myself. He thought he was discarding something worthless, but he was actually setting free something priceless. My potential unfiltered by his limitations, my dreams undimmed by his shadow, my future undefined by his past. To anyone reading this who sees themselves in my story, who has been told they're not enough, who has sacrificed their dreams for someone else's ambition, who has been discarded when they were no longer useful, know this. Your value doesn't diminish because someone couldn't see it. Your contributions matter even if they were never acknowledged. Your future can be bigger than your past, no matter how much that past hurt. The morning I'm writing this, I received news that EmpowerHer Legal has been acquired by a major tech company for $500 million. I'll stay on as CEO, maintaining our mission while scaling our impact. The girl who was publicly humiliated for not matching her husband's ambition just built something worth $500 million. The poetry of that isn't lost on me. But the real victory isn't the money or the recognition. It's that every morning thousands of women log into our platform and find hope during their darkest moments. They find lawyers who treat them with dignity, support groups who understand their pain, and resources that empower them to build new lives from the ashes of old ones. They find what I desperately needed that night in the Grand Marquis, proof that this isn't the end of their story. Marcus was wrong when he said I would end up nowhere. I ended up exactly where I was meant to be. Not beside someone else living their dream, but standing on my own living mine. The view from here is spectacular, not because of how high I've climbed, but because of how many women I can see climbing with me. We rise together stronger for our scars, wiser for our wounds, and unstoppable in our determination to never again shrink ourselves for someone else's comfort. Looking back at that night in the Grand Marquis, I want to tell that woman in the red dress that everything will be okay. Better than okay. That the humiliation burning her cheeks will transform into fuel for her rocket ship. That the man walking away from her is actually walking out of her way. That the envelope he handed her wasn't divorce papers, but liberation documents. That 4 months later, he'll be begging for her help while she's building an empire. But she wouldn't have believed me then. She had to live it to understand that sometimes the person who breaks you is actually doing you a favor. They're showing you that you were always whole without them. They're forcing you to discover strength you didn't know existed. They're accidentally giving you the gift of having nothing left to lose and everything to gain. So thank you, Marcus. Thank you for that envelope at your promotion dinner. Thank you for the public humiliation that became public vindication. Thank you for showing me who you really were so I could finally see who I really am. A builder, a leader, a survivor, a success story that began the moment you thought my story had ended. The papers you served me that night weren't just divorce documents. They were my admission letter to a better life, my invitation to authentic success, my permission slip to stop playing small. You thought you were ending my chapter in your story, but you were actually starting my own book. And unlike yours, it's a bestseller. What questions do you have about starting over after betrayal? Have you ever had someone underestimate you only to prove them completely wrong? I'd love to hear your stories of transformation in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that their current ending might actually be their new beginning. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of women who turned their worst moments into their greatest victories. Thank you for listening to my journey. And remember, sometimes the person who breaks your heart accidentally sets your soul free.